I'm Lucille, 62 years old, and I never imagined that becoming a widow would also make me a target. When my husband Frank died, he left behind $29 million that nobody knew about, including our son. I kept this inheritance quiet, living in our modest home, driving my old sedan. Then, my son Martin and his wife Stephanie invited me to dinner. Their smiles seemed genuine until they weren't. I just smiled back. Before I tell you how I discovered my own son's true intentions, let me know where you're watching from today. Hit that like button if you've ever had to make a difficult decision about family and money. I met Frank at the public library, where I worked in Mapleton, a small town in the Midwest. I was 22, arranging books on shelves, when he approached, asking for help, finding resources on business startups. Frank wasn't like the other men I'd dated. He wore simple clothes, drove a practical car, and spoke thoughtfully about ideas rather than possessions. Our courtship was as modest as our personalities. Frank would bring me home-cooked meals during my late shifts at the library, and I would save interesting articles I thought might help his fledgling real estate business. We married after 8 months in a small ceremony with just family and close friends. I don't need expensive things to feel special, I told him when he apologized for not being able to afford a diamond. The simple gold band he gave me meant more than any jewel ever could. In those early years, we lived paycheck to paycheck in a one-bedroom apartment. Frank worked 18-hour days building his real estate company, while I supported us with my library salary. We saved every penny possible, often eating simple meals of rice and beans, finding free community activities for entertainment. Wealth should be a quiet guardian, not a loud companion, Frank would say. This philosophy guided our lives even as his business began to flourish. While other successful business owners in our community upgraded to mansions and luxury cars, we moved to a modest 3-bedroom home and kept our reliable, if unimpressive, vehicles. As the years passed, Frank's investments in real estate expanded. He had an uncanny ability to identify undervalued properties in emerging neighborhoods. In the early 90s, he also began investing in technology companies, something unusual for real estate investors at the time. "I believe computers will change everything," he told me over dinner one night. "The internet isn't just a fad. Those early tech investments multiplied exponentially, but our lifestyle remained virtually unchanged. We took one vacation per year, usually driving rather than flying. We ate out occasionally, but nothing extravagant. To our neighbors, and even our son Martin, we appeared to be comfortably middle class, nothing more. This was intentional." Frank and I agreed that flaunting wealth often created more problems than it solved. We'd seen how money changed people's behavior, how it attracted false friends, and created entitled children. "Let's give Martin values instead of valuables," Frank suggested when our son was born. We raised him to appreciate hard work, education, and character over material possessions. Martin never had the newest toys or trendiest clothes, but he never lacked for love opportunities or necessities. When Martin left for college, Frank and I finally had the freedom to discuss our growing financial empire more openly at home. By then, his real estate holdings had expanded across 3 states, and his tech investments had generated returns beyond anything we'd imagined possible. "We should think about what happens to all this when we're gone," Frank said one evening. "It's still early to worry about that," I replied, not wanting to confront the idea of losing him. But Frank was always the pragmatic one. "No one lives forever, Lucy, and money without wisdom can do more harm than good." I never participated much in Frank's financial planning sessions. Numbers made my eyes glaze over, and Frank seemed to have everything under control. In retrospect, I wish I'd paid more attention. But isn't that always the way We never truly appreciate something until it's gone. 3 years ago, Frank started experiencing persistent back pain. When it didn't resolve with physical therapy, we sought additional medical opinions. The diagnosis was devastating pancreatic cancer, already at stage 4. How long? I asked the doctor, my voice barely a whisper. 6 months, possibly a year, with aggressive treatment, he replied with practiced compassion. Those final months with Frank were precious and painful in equal measure. Between treatments, Frank spent more time than ever with his financial advisors and attorneys. When I asked about these meetings, he would simply say, "I'm making sure you'll be taken care of, Lucy." I assumed he meant our modest savings and investments would be enough for me to live comfortably in retirement. I had no idea of the true extent of our wealth. Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep, 11 months after his diagnosis. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight that made even getting out of bed a monumental task. The funeral passed in a blur of tear-streaked faces and murmured condolences. 3 days after the funeral, Frank's primary attorney, Harold Berkowitz, requested a meeting. I assumed it was standard estate settlement procedures. I arrived at his downtown office, dressed in my funeral black, still numb from loss. "Mrs. Harrington, before we begin, Frank wanted me to give you this," Harold said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Frank. "My dearest Lucy, if you're reading this, I've moved on to whatever comes next. I'm sorry to leave you alone, but I'm not worried about you. You're stronger than you know. What might surprise you is the extent of what we've built together. While you gave our life heart, I tried to give it security. The full details are with Harold, but know this, you will never have to worry about money again. Be wise with it. Be happy. All my love, Frank." Harold then walked me through the assets' commercial properties across 5 states, residential buildings in 3 cities, stock portfolios diversified across technology, pharmaceuticals, and sustainable energy. The vineyard in Sonoma County that Frank had purchased 10 years ago without telling me, calling it our retirement project. The lakefront property in Michigan that was meant to be a surprise for our 40th anniversary, and the total value, $29 million. I nearly fainted right there in Harold's office. "Mrs. Harrington, would you like some water?" Harold asked, concerned by my pale face. "All this time," I whispered, "I had no idea." Frank was adamant about privacy, Harold explained. He believed that wealth broadcast invited problems. As I drove home in my 8-year-old sedan, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. The modest 3-bedroom house I pulled up to seemed incongruous with what I had just learned. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at our kitchen table, the same one where Frank and I had shared thousands of meals, never once discussing our millions. I decided then to honor Frank's philosophy. I would continue living modestly, at least for now. I would tell no one about the inheritance, not even Martin. First, I needed time to process everything and decide how to move forward wisely. What I didn't realize then was how quickly this decision would prove to be the right one. Our son Martin grew up with all the love any child could want, but without the material excesses many of his peers enjoyed. Frank and I emphasized education, compassion, and integrity. We paid for his college education, but insisted he work summer jobs to understand the value of labor. He graduated with a business degree and seemed to embrace the values we'd tried to instill. Then he met Stephanie during his first job at a marketing firm in Chicago. Stephanie came from old money, though apparently not much was left by the time her generation inherited it. Her family name opened doors, but her bank account didn't match her lifestyle aspirations. She was beautiful, charismatic, and had exquisite taste. I tried to like her. I truly did. She makes Martin happy, Frank said after meeting her. But I worry she's going to change his priorities. Frank's concern proved prophetic. Within a year of dating, Stephanie Martin's calls became less frequent. When he did call, he talked about restaurants with celebrity chefs, weekend trips to New York, and the apartment they couldn't quite afford in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. Their wedding was lavish, beyond anything Frank and I would have chosen. Stephanie's parents contributed little financially, despite the event reflecting their social circle's expectations. Frank and I covered most expenses, though we drew a line at the $50,000 floral arrangements Stephanie initially requested. "It's their day," Frank said when I expressed concern about the spending. "But there are limits to what we'll support." After the wedding, the changes in Martin accelerated. He switched jobs 3 times in 5 years, always chasing higher salaries, rather than meaningful work. They bought a house in an exclusive suburb they couldn't really afford. 2 luxury cars appeared in their driveway. Stephanie didn't work, explaining she was building her personal brand through social media and charity events. Meanwhile, their credit card debt mounted. Martin never directly asked for money, but he dropped hints about their financial stress during our increasingly infrequent conversations. "The property taxes here are killing us," he'd say. Or, "Stephanie's car needed repairs that cost more than your entire car, Mom." I'd offer budgeting advice, which he'd dismiss with a laugh. "We're not living in the 70s anymore, Mom. Everyone carries some debt these days." When Frank got sick, Martin and Stephanie visited exactly 3 times in 11 months. Each visit was brief, with Stephanie checking her watch and mentioning other commitments. They never offered to help with appointments or treatments. "They're busy building their lives," Frank said, always making excuses for our son. "We raised him to be independent." But I saw the hurt in Frank's eyes when weeks passed without a call from Martin. After Frank died, something shifted. Martin called daily for the first week, asking how I was doing, if I needed anything. Stephanie sent flowers and a heartfelt card that seemed out of character for her. Then came the dinner invitation exactly 1 week after the funeral. "We want to take you somewhere nice, Mom," Martin said. "Get you out of the house. Stephanie found this great new restaurant downtown." "That's very thoughtful," I replied, though something about the sudden attention made me uneasy. "And afterward, we should talk about what happens next," he added. "You know, living arrangements, finances, all that stuff. Dad would want us to make sure you're taken care of." The concern would have seemed genuine, if not for the fact that neither of them had shown much interest in taking care of Frank during his illness. Still, I agreed to the dinner. Perhaps grief was bringing out a better side of them. "That sounds lovely," I said. "I look forward to it." As I hung up the phone, a nagging voice in my head whispered that their sudden solicitousness had nothing to do with concern for me. But surely my own son wouldn't have ulterior motives toward his recently widowed mother. How wrong I was. The restaurant Stephanie selected was the kind that doesn't put prices on the menu given to women. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and sommeliers hovered near each table. My simple black dress and pearl earrings, perfectly appropriate for most occasions, felt dowdy compared to Stephanie's designer outfit. "Mom, you look nice," Martin said, with the slightly patronizing tone one might use with a child. "Thank you for suggesting this place," I replied, "though it seems rather extravagant." "You deserve to be spoiled," Stephanie interjected, waving to the sommelier. "We're celebrating Frank's life. He'd want us to enjoy ourselves." The sommelier approached and Stephanie ordered a $300 bottle of wine without consulting either of us. I remembered Frank's disdain for overpriced restaurant wine and suppressed a smile. "So, Mom," Martin began after our first course arrived, "have you had time to go through Dad's papers yet?" "Some," I answered vaguely. "Harold Berkowitz has been helpful with the essential documents." "Harold, Dad's business attorney." Martin's eyebrows rose slightly. I didn't realize Dad had significant business interests. The careful phrasing caught my attention. I didn't know Dad had a business attorney, but rather an acknowledgement of already knowing about Harold, coupled with a fishing attempt for more information. Frank liked having professional help with our taxes and retirement accounts, I said, watching their reactions. Stephanie and Martin exchanged a quick glance. "Speaking of retirement," Stephanie said, reaching for my hand across the table, "we've been so worried about you rattling around in that big house all alone." The house that Stephanie had previously described as quaint and modest was suddenly big. "I'm managing fine," I replied. "It's only been a week." "Of course you are," Martin said. "But long-term, it makes sense to consider your options. The property taxes, maintenance, utilities for a single person. We have a beautiful guest house," Stephanie added. "Private entrance, lovely garden view. You'd have independence, but not isolation." I took a sip of the overpriced wine to hide my surprise at how quickly they'd moved from expressions of sympathy to suggesting I give up my home. "That's very generous," I said carefully, "but it seems premature to make such big decisions so soon after Frank's passing." "Actually, Mom," Martin leaned forward, "there are some time-sensitive matters we should address. For estate tax reasons, it would be advantageous to transfer property ownership sooner rather than later." "Property ownership?" I asked innocently. "The house," Martin clarified, "and any other properties Dad might have owned. We brought some paperwork that would allow us to help manage any assets Dad left behind. Just a simple transfer that puts everything in a family trust we can oversee for you." "We could put the vineyard property to good use," Stephanie added, then froze, realizing her mistake. I carefully set down my wine glass. "Vineyard property," Martin shot Stephanie a warning look before smoothly continuing. "If there is one. Dad mentioned some investment properties over the years. We just want to make sure everything is properly managed." My mind was racing. The only way they could know about the vineyard was if they'd accessed information they shouldn't have. Frank and I had never discussed it with Martin, as Frank had only planned to reveal it after fully setting up our retirement there. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice steady, despite my inner turmoil. "But Harold is handling everything according to Frank's wishes." "Mom," Martin's voice hardened slightly, "no offense, but you've never been financially savvy. Dad always handled the money. Without him, you need guidance." "Martin's in finance," Stephanie added, as if I'd forgotten my own son's career. "And I've managed my family's assets for years." The irony of Stephanie claiming financial expertise when they were clearly living beyond their means was almost amusing. "Tell you what," I said, forcing a smile. "Why don't you leave those papers with me? I'll review them and discuss them with Harold." "There's really no need to involve outside attorneys at this stage," Martin said quickly. "This is family business." The pressure they were applying only confirmed my growing suspicions. "I'll think about your offer," I said, deliberately vague. "It's very thoughtful." They relaxed slightly, interpreting my response as acquiescence. The conversation turned to lighter topics, but I noticed how they kept steering it back to financial matters, the rising property values in their neighborhood, the expense of maintaining older homes, the benefits of consolidating family resources. When the check arrived, Martin made a show of insisting on paying, though I wondered if it would go on an already overburdened credit card. As we said our goodbyes, in the parking lot, Stephanie hugged me tightly. "We just want what's best for you," she whispered. "Frank would want you to be taken care of." "Yes," I agreed, meeting her gaze steadily. Frank definitely wanted me taken care of. I drove home in my reliable old sedan, my mind churning with questions and a deep sense of betrayal. How had they learned about the vineyard? What else did they know? And most painfully, had their recent attentiveness been nothing but a calculated attempt to get their hands on Frank's assets? I just smiled and said I'd think about it. But inside, I knew I needed answers. Sleep eluded me that night. I kept replaying the dinner conversation, each word and glance taking on new significance. By morning, I had decided to investigate how Martin and Stephanie had learned about assets that were supposed to be confidential. I called Harold Berkowitz as soon as his office opened. "Harold, I need to see you today. There's been a concerning development." His secretary cleared his schedule for 11 a.m. When I arrived, Harold's normally calm demeanor shifted to alarm as I recounted the dinner conversation. "They specifically mentioned the vineyard?" he asked, brow furrowed. "Yes," Stephanie let it slip. "They also brought transfer documents they wanted me to sign immediately." Harold removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. Harrington, the only people who know about all of Frank's holdings are myself, my assistant, Frank's financial advisor, and now you. We need to figure out how this information was compromised." We systematically reviewed possibilities. Had someone from Harold's office leaked information? Had Martin or Stephanie contacted Frank's financial institutions directly? Each possibility was investigated and dismissed. Then Harold asked, did Martin have access to Frank's personal computer or phone after his passing? The funeral reception. We'd hosted it at our home. I remembered seeing Martin slip upstairs at one point. He might have used Frank's computer during the funeral reception, I admitted. I was busy with guests. Harold immediately called a digital forensics specialist who owed him a favor. By that afternoon, we had our answer. Someone had accessed Frank's email account the day of the funeral, forwarding several confidential messages to an external address that matched Martin's personal email. The emails included correspondence with Harold about the vineyard management statements from the account holding the bulk of our assets, and details about the lakefront property. I sat in Harold's office, holding the printed evidence, feeling as if I'd been physically struck. My own son had snooped through his father's private correspondence, while I was downstairs receiving condolences. He'd stolen information during his father's funeral. "Mrs. Harrington, I recommend we take immediate steps to secure your assets," Harold said gently, "given this breach and their obvious intentions." Through my shock and heartbreak, I nodded. What do we need to do? Over the next 3 days, we worked with Frank's financial team to secure accounts change passwords and ensure Martin couldn't access any further information. Harold suggested additional legal protections, including a revocable trust that would be challenging to contest. Should I confront them? I asked after we'd implemented the security measures. "That's a personal decision," Harold replied. "But from a strategic perspective, it might be wise to understand the full extent of their intentions before showing your hand." I called my oldest friend, Diana, that evening. We'd been friends since college, and she'd experienced her own financial betrayal when her ex-husband emptied their accounts before divorcing her. "You need to see how far they'll go," Diana advised after I explained the situation. "If you confront them now, they'll just deny it and be more careful. You need to know exactly what you're dealing with. I can't believe Martin would do this, I said, tears finally breaking through. Where did we go wrong with him? Lucy, this isn't about your parenting, Diana said firmly. Martin is an adult making his own choices, and from what you've told me about Stephanie, she's likely driving much of this. With Diana's support and Harold's legal guidance, I developed a plan. I would invite Martin and Stephanie to lunch at my home, giving them another opportunity to reveal their true intentions. I would appear receptive to their suggestions, even vulnerable, to see how far they would push. You don't have to do this alone, Diana offered. I can be there maybe in another room. Having moral support seemed wise. Could you come over early? We'll say you stopped by to check on me, and we'll ask if they mind if you stay. The day before their visit, Diana helped me stage the house to appear even more modest than it was. We removed some nicer artwork, replacing it with inexpensive prints. I dressed down in my oldest sweater and jeans, applied no makeup, and prepared a simple lunch of soup and sandwiches. Remember, Diana coached, as we rehearsed, let them lead the conversation. Act slightly confused about financial matters. Take notes if they make suggestions, as if you're seriously considering them. What if they push for an immediate decision? I asked. Stall. Say you need to sleep on it. Say you want to pray about it. Anything to buy time. That night, alone in the bed I'd shared with Frank for 4 decades, I whispered to his memory, I wish you were here to handle this, but I'll make you proud. I promise. Martin and Stephanie arrived precisely at noon the next day, carrying a bakery box and forced smiles. Diana was already there, as planned, having stopped by to check on me. Oh, we didn't realize you'd have company, Stephanie said, her smile faltering slightly when she saw Diana. Diana just came to see how I'm holding up, I explained. You don't mind if she joins us, do you? She's been such a support since Frank passed. Of course not, Martin said, though his tone suggested otherwise. The more the merrier. I led them into the dining room, where I'd set the table with my everyday dishes rather than the good china. The simple lunch I'd prepared clearly disappointed Stephanie, who picked at her sandwich while glancing around the room assessingly. So, Mom, have you had a chance to look over those papers we discussed? Martin asked, barely waiting until we'd all been served. I glanced at them, I answered vaguely. There seemed to be a lot of legal terminology I wasn't familiar with. That's why you have us, Stephanie interjected. Martin deals with these sorts of documents every day. I just want to make sure I understand what I'd be signing, I said, feigning slight confusion. It mentioned transferring property. It's a simple family trust arrangement, Martin explained, pulling a folder from his briefcase. Basically, you transfer your assets into a trust that we help manage. It protects against estate taxes and simplifies everything. All your assets would still be yours, Stephanie added quickly. We'd just handle the administrative details. At your age, you shouldn't have to worry about these things. At my age, I was 62, not 92. What about the house? I asked innocently. Would that go into this trust too? Absolutely, Martin nodded enthusiastically. In fact, we've already researched what it might sell for. The market's hot right now. I raised my eyebrows. Sell, I thought you said everything would still be mine. Well, yes, Martin backpedaled slightly. But maintaining this house doesn't make sense long term. Remember our offer about the guest house, much more manageable for you. I see, I murmured, making a show of taking notes on a pad next to my plate. And what about other assets? Would those be sold too? It depends on the asset, Stephanie said. Some investments might do better if liquidated and reinvested. Like that vineyard property, for instance. The hospitality industry is booming in Sonoma. With the right development plan, it could be worth millions more than its current value of $4.2 million. There it was. Not only did they know about the vineyard, but they knew its exact appraised value information that had only been in Frank's private emails. $4.2 million, I echoed, watching their faces. That sounds like a lot. It's a fair valuation, Stephanie said confidently. My cousin works in luxury property development. He's already expressed interest if we decide to sell. If we decide to sell. Not if I decide to sell. I'm not sure Frank would have wanted to sell the vineyard, I said softly. He was looking forward to retiring there. Dad's gone, Mom, Martin said bluntly. We need to make decisions based on what's best now, not what he might have wanted. Diana, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. It seems like you two have put a lot of thought into Lucille's assets already. That's rather proactive of you. Stephanie shot her an annoyed glance. We're just trying to help before decisions become urgent. What's the urgency exactly? Diana pressed. Lucille is in good health. Estate taxes, Martin answered promptly. And the longer property sits unmanaged, the more it depreciates. I noticed he didn't meet my eyes when he said this. Frank had structured everything specifically to minimize estate taxes, a fact Martin would know if he'd read all the emails he'd forwarded to himself. These documents, I said, gesturing to the folder Martin had brought, would give you control over everything Frank left me. Joint management, Martin corrected. You'd still be involved in major decisions. But you'd have signing authority, I persisted. For efficiency, he explained, becoming visibly impatient. Mom, I don't understand why you're hesitating. You've never handled finances before. Dad always made the money decisions. That's true, I acknowledged. Frank did manage our investments. So you understand why this makes sense, Stephanie said, reaching for my hand. We're doing this for you. I allowed my hand to be held while asking, how did you learn about the vineyard? Frank and I never mentioned it. The sudden question caught them off guard. Martin froze momentarily before answering. Dad mentioned it once or twice. Investments he was considering. Mentioned it with enough detail that you know its exact current valuation. I pressed gently. Stephanie jumped in. Research. Once we knew it existed, Martin looked into it to understand what we're dealing with. And how exactly did you first learn it existed? Diana asked pointedly. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted from pressuring to defensive. What's with the third degree? Martin asked, his voice hardening. We're trying to help you, Mom, not steal from you. I set down my pen and looked directly at my son. Martin, I know you accessed your father's email account during the funeral reception. I know you forwarded confidential information to yourself. The color drained from his face. That's ridiculous. Why would I do that? I have the digital forensics report, I said quietly. The login to Frank's account was tracked to our home computer during the exact hours of the reception. The emails were forwarded to your personal address. Stephanie recovered first. So what if he did? He was trying to understand his father's affairs after being kept in the dark for years. That's hardly a crime. Actually, Diana interjected, unauthorized access to someone's email account is legally problematic. Oh, please, Stephanie snapped. He was accessing his dead father's account, not hacking a bank. Martin held up his hand to silence his wife. Mom, try to understand. Dad never shared anything about family finances with me. What was I supposed to do? Wait around while some lawyer decided what information I deserved to have about my own father's estate? You could have asked me, I said simply. Would you have told me about the $29 million? he challenged. Or the lakefront property, or the vineyard. Eventually, yes, I answered truthfully, once I'd had time to process everything myself. Eventually, he repeated bitterly. Meanwhile, you'd be making decisions that affect my inheritance without any input from me. There it was, my inheritance. Not my financial security, not my future, but what he perceived as his future windfall. Martin, I said softly, your father and I earned that money over 40 years of hard work and careful investing. It's not your inheritance yet. It's my life. Dad would have wanted me to have a say, he insisted. I'm his son, his only child. Frank wanted me to be secure and independent, I corrected. And he didn't trust that you had the judgment yet to handle this kind of wealth responsibly. Martin's face flushed with anger. That's not true. He was going to make me his business successor. He told me so. This was a complete fabrication. Frank had never indicated any such intention. Martin, I said gently, I think you're confusing what you hoped for with what was actually planned. This is bullshit, he exploded, standing up so abruptly his chair tipped over. We come here trying to help you, and you ambush us with accusations. Stephanie also stood gathering her designer handbag. Clearly, you've been poisoned against us. Probably by her. She jabbed a finger toward Diana. No one has poisoned me against you, I said, remaining seated and calm. Your own actions have shown your intentions. Our intentions were to help family, Martin said through clenched teeth. But apparently, you'd rather be manipulated by outsiders than trust your own son. Trust works both ways, Martin, I replied. You violated your father's privacy during his funeral. You've been plotting to take control of assets you only learned about through deception. How exactly have you earned my trust? We're leaving, Stephanie announced dramatically. Call us when you've come to your senses. Before you go, I said, still maintaining my composure, you should know that I've already taken steps to protect the estate. All accounts have new security protocols, and the trust structure has been revised. Nothing can be transferred without multiple verifications that I personally control. Martin's face contorted with rage. You had no right. I had every right. They're my assets, left to me by my husband. This isn't over, he threatened, grabbing his briefcase. If you think I'm going to let some elderly widow squander my father's legacy, you're mistaken. We'll fight this in court if necessary. The elderly widow comment stung, but I didn't let it show. You're welcome to try, I said calmly. But before you engage expensive attorneys, you might want to review Frank's will. It's quite specific about what happens if any beneficiary contests its terms. This was true. Frank had included a no-contest clause that would effectively disinherit anyone who challenged the will's provisions. Martin faltered slightly, revealing that he hadn't read the will as thoroughly as he'd pretended. Think carefully about your next steps, I advised. This doesn't have to become an irreparable family rift. You've already created the rift, Stephanie hissed, coming between a son and his rightful inheritance. I stood now, finally allowing some of my hurt and disappointment to show. I think you should leave now, both of you. Martin grabbed Stephanie's elbow and steered her toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back, his expression dark with resentment. You'll regret this, Mom. Nobody can manage that kind of money alone, especially someone with your limited experience. You'll come crawling back for help eventually. The door slammed behind them, rattling the modest family photos that lined our entryway. Diana came up beside me, putting her arm around my shoulders. You did well, Lucy. I know that wasn't easy. The composed facade I'd maintained crumbled, and I began to sob. That's not my son, The boy I raised would never have done this. Diana led me to the couch, holding me, while years of maternal hopes collapsed under the weight of this betrayal. "What happens now?" I whispered, when the tears finally subsided. "Now," Diana said firmly, "you begin to build a life that honors Frank's legacy without being controlled by your son's greed. And I'll be right here helping you every step of the way." After Martin and Stephanie stormed out, a profound emptiness settled over me. I'd lost Frank, and now, in a different way, I'd lost my son, too. The grief felt overwhelming, like drowning in successive waves, with no chance to catch my breath between them. "I can't believe this is happening," I told Diana, as we sat in my living room, the untouched lunch still on the dining table. "What kind of son goes through his father's private emails during his funeral? The kind who's been influenced by someone like Stephanie for years," Diana replied gently. "This didn't happen overnight, Lucy." She was right. The signs had been there. Martin's shifting values after marriage, the increasingly materialistic lifestyle, the gradual emotional distance from us. Frank had noticed it too, but always made excuses for our only child. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I called Harold. "I need a referral," I said. "Not a legal one, a therapist who understands family wealth issues." Harold connected me with Dr. Eleanor Friedman, a psychologist specializing in family dynamics, complicated by significant assets. Our first session was 3 days later. "What you're experiencing is unfortunately common," Dr. Friedman told me after I recounted recent events. "Money often doesn't change people so much as it reveals who they truly are. Your son and daughter-in-law showed their priorities when tested." "How do I deal with this pain?" I asked. "I keep wondering where Frank and I went wrong in raising him." "This isn't necessarily a reflection of your parenting," she assured me. "Adults make their own choices. Your son has been influenced by his wife, certainly, but ultimately, he's responsible for his actions." Over the next several weeks, our sessions helped me process not just the betrayal, but also my new reality as a wealthy widow. Dr. Friedman encouraged me to take small steps toward independence and self-discovery. Meanwhile, silence from Martin and Stephanie stretched from days into weeks. I resisted the urge to reach out, giving us all space to reflect. Dr. Friedman had advised against immediate reconciliation attempts, suggesting that natural consequences needed time to sink in. 1 month after our confrontation, a certified letter arrived from an attorney representing Martin and Stephanie. They were demanding a fair and equitable distribution of Frank's estate, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage such substantial assets. Harold dismissed their claims immediately. "This has no legal merit whatsoever. Frank's will is ironclad, and there's zero evidence of any mental incapacity on your part." Still, the legal maneuvering hurt deeply. They were not just after the money now. They were attacking my competence, my very autonomy. "This is their desperation showing," Harold reassured me. "They've realized they can't manipulate you, so they're trying intimidation." His legal team responded with a firmly worded letter reminding Martin of the no contest clause in the will. The threatened lawsuit never materialized, though the emotional damage was already done. As spring arrived, I decided it was time for changes. The house, once filled with memories of family dinners and Christmas mornings, now felt tainted by recent events. Each room reminded me of Martin's betrayal during the funeral reception. "I think I'd like to see the lakefront house," I told Harold during one of our regular meetings, the one Frank bought for our anniversary. The property was located on Lake Michigan's eastern shore, a modern glass and cedar structure, perched on a bluff overlooking the water. Frank had purchased it 3 years earlier, planning to surprise me on our upcoming 40th anniversary, a milestone we never reached. As I toured the house with the caretaker, I felt Frank's presence in every thoughtful detail. The kitchen was designed exactly as I'd always described my dream cooking space. The library featured built-in shelves similar to those I'd admired in magazines. The master bedroom overlooked the lake, positioned perfectly to catch both sunrise and sunset. "He was building this for you for years," the caretaker explained. "Mr. Harrington would visit every few months, always with new ideas or adjustments based on things you'd mentioned." Tears blurred my vision as I stood on the deck watching waves crash against the shore below. This house represented not just Frank's financial success, but his deep love and attention to my happiness. "I'd like to move in," I decided on the spot. "How quickly can we make that happen?" Within a month, I'd sold our modest family home and relocated to the lakefront property. The sale of the old house didn't make the news, but if Martin was monitoring property records, he'd know I'd made a significant change. Once settled in my new home, I decided to visit the vineyard in Sonoma. Harold arranged for the property manager, Gabriel Mendoza, to give me a tour. Gabriel had worked with Frank for 8 years, developing the neglected property into a small but respected vineyard. "Your husband had a vision," Gabriel explained as we walked among the vines. "Not for a commercial operation, but for a community space where people could connect with the land and each other." He showed me architectural plans Frank had commissioned, but never shared with me. They included a small winery, educational facilities for sustainable agriculture workshops, and spaces for community gatherings. "Frank talked about how you two would host dinners here," Gabriel continued, "how you'd invite local families to harvest celebrations. He saw this place bringing people together." Once again, I found myself discovering new dimensions to the man I thought I knew completely after 40 years of marriage. Frank hadn't just been accumulating wealth. He'd been creating a legacy of connection and community. "I'd like to continue what he started," I told Gabriel. "Can you teach me about wine production, about what it would take to realize these plans?" Gabriel's face lit up. "It would be my honor, Mrs. Harrington." Over the following months, I divided my time between the lakefront house and the vineyard. I learned about soil composition, grape varieties, and fermentation processes. I studied the business side of small-scale wine production and researched sustainable agricultural practices. When not working at the vineyard, I explored my new lakeside community, gradually forming friendships with neighbors and local business owners. For the first time in my adult life, I was defining myself not as Frank's wife or Martin's mother, but simply as Lucille. I also began working with Harold to establish a foundation, honoring Frank's philanthropic interests. We funded educational scholarships, environmental conservation efforts, and community development projects in areas where Frank had owned properties. All these activities were conducted quietly, without publicity. I maintained Frank's philosophy that wealth should be a quiet guardian, not a loud companion. But the work gave me purpose and gradually helped heal the wound of Martin's betrayal. 6 months after our confrontation, I received an email from Martin. The tone was stiff, formal. Nothing like communications between mother and son should be. "Mother, I hope this message finds you well. I've been reflecting on recent events and believe we should attempt to reestablish communication. Please let me know if you would be amenable to a conversation. Martin. I stared at the screen, a mixture of hope and wariness battling within me. Was this a genuine olive branch or another manipulation attempt? After consulting with Dr. Friedman, I crafted a careful response. Martin, I would welcome the opportunity to talk. However, any rebuilding of our relationship must be based on mutual respect and trust. I suggest we meet with a family therapist present for our first conversation. Let me know if you're open to this approach. Love, Mom. His response came 3 days later, accepting the terms, but with clear reluctance. It wasn't the enthusiastic reconciliation I might have hoped for, but it was a start. My journey from betrayal to healing wasn't swift or linear. There were days when grief over Frank's absence overwhelmed me, nights when Martin's betrayal kept me awake replaying our confrontation, wondering if I could have handled things differently. But gradually, something remarkable happened. I discovered strength I never knew I possessed and built a life filled with purpose and authentic connections. The first meeting with Martin and the family therapist was awkward and tense. Stephanie refused to attend, claiming the issues were between Martin and his mother. In truth, her absence made genuine communication easier. I felt blindsided, Martin admitted during our second session. Dad never shared anything about his business success with me. Finding those emails felt like discovering he'd led a double life. Frank was private about finances with everyone, including me, I explained. He believed flaunting wealth created problems. But I'm his son, Martin countered. He should have prepared me, included me in the business. The therapist interjected gently. It sounds like you're feeling hurt about being excluded, which is understandable. But does that justify how you responded? It took several more sessions before Martin began acknowledging how his actions had violated trust. The breakthrough came when he finally admitted Stephanie's significant influence. She's always believed my parents were holding out, he confessed. When we found out about the assets, she saw it as confirmation. She pushed hard for me to secure our share immediately. And what did you think? I asked. I was angry too, he admitted. I felt entitled to know everything, to have a say immediately. But I crossed lines I shouldn't have. Meanwhile, my own life continued evolving. The vineyard's first community harvest event attracted local families and school groups. Following Frank's vision, we donated most of the proceeds to food security programs, while reserving a portion for expansion. At the lakefront house, I hosted small gatherings for neighbors and new friends. One neighbor, Barbara, was a retired literature professor who shared my love of mystery novels. Another, James, taught cooking classes and helped me finally master soufflés in my dream kitchen. These friendships, based on shared interests rather than financial considerations, brought genuine joy. 3 months into our therapy sessions, Martin called with news. Stephanie and I are separating, he said, his voice tight with emotion. She's filing for divorce. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. Regardless of my feelings about Stephanie, I never wanted my son to experience pain. Don't be, he replied. This has been coming for a while. The money situation just brought our differences to a head. She wanted to keep pushing the legal challenges against you, even after our attorney advised against it. What will you do now? I asked. Focus on myself for a while. Figure out who I am without her influence. Maybe get back to the values Dad tried to teach me. It wasn't an explicit apology, but it felt like progress. As the 1-year anniversary of Frank's death approached, I made an important decision about the inheritance. Working with Harold, I established the Harrington Family Foundation with clear guidelines for its management. The bulk of Frank's fortune would fund community initiatives, educational opportunities, and environmental conservation. I created educational trusts for any future grandchildren, structured with ethical guidelines about how and when funds could be accessed. These trusts emphasized education, entrepreneurship, and community service rather than passive income. For Martin, I established a separate trust that would provide reasonable support while encouraging personal growth and responsibility. Access to larger sums would be tied to demonstrated financial maturity and ethical decision-making. I'm not punishing him, I explained to Harold. I'm honoring Frank's belief that wealth without wisdom does more harm than good. Frank would be proud of you, Harold said. You've handled this entire situation with remarkable grace. When I shared these plans with Martin during a private dinner, his reaction surprised me. It's fair, he said after reviewing the documents. More than fair, actually, considering what happened. Dad was right about not trusting me with everything at once. I wasn't ready. You will be, I assured him. That's why these structures exist, to give you time to grow into the responsibility. Our relationship remained a work in progress. Some wounds heal slowly, and trust rebuilds even more gradually. But we were finding our way back to something authentic, if different from before. The lakefront house gradually became the gathering place Frank had envisioned, though not exactly as he'd planned. Instead of hosting our children and grandchildren, I welcomed friends, neighbors, community members connected to the foundation's work, and occasionally Martin during his visits. The vineyard thrived under Gabriel's management and my growing involvement. We implemented Frank's community-centered vision, hosting educational programs for local schools and creating a small but vibrant farm-to-table restaurant that showcased regional produce. On difficult days, I still visited the lakeside deck, where I felt closest to Frank. One evening, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson, I spoke to him as if he were beside me. You knew this might happen, didn't you? That's why you structured everything so carefully. You were protecting me not just from financial threats, but from the pain of discovering who Martin had become. The breeze carried no response, but I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I'm okay, Frank. Better than okay. I've discovered strengths I never knew I had. I'm carrying forward your legacy while creating my own, and I'm even finding ways to help Martin become the man you always hoped he would be. The water reflected the last golden rays of sunlight as dusk approached. In that moment, I understood the truest inheritance Frank had left me wasn't the millions in the bank accounts or the properties. It was the wisdom to handle wealth as a tool for positive impact rather than a source of identity or power. My journey from betrayal to empowerment taught me that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't giving people what they want, but what they truly need, even when that means setting boundaries and allowing natural consequences. Frank had understood this, and now so did I. I've learned that money doesn't create character flaws. It merely magnifies what's already there. I've discovered that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in authentic relationships, meaningful purpose, and the courage to stand firm in your values, even when it's painful. And, perhaps most importantly, I've found that it's never too late to reinvent yourself, to discover strengths you never knew you possessed, to build a life rich with purpose and connection. Has anyone in your family ever revealed surprising intentions regarding money or inheritance? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If you found value in my journey, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more true stories of life's unexpected lessons. And if you know someone who might benefit from this story, please share it with them. Remember, sometimes the greatest gift isn't what's left to you, but the wisdom to handle it well. Thank you for listening, and may you find the courage to trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right in your relationships.